Hi, my name is Draft and I'm a Shadow Priest main. In today's video I'm going to be covering a 9.0.5 Mythic Plus guide for Shadow Priests using the newly buffed legendary Shadowflame Prism. In this video I'm also going to be covering our talents and soulbind choices for every single dungeon, as well as going over our AoE Opener and Rotation and some tips to help you do more damage. So, what are my credentials for making this video? Well, currently I'm a 2400 IO Shadow Priest in Shadowlands Season 1. I've been pushing relatively high keys since BFA Season 4. Getting right into the video, what are some of the strengths of Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus? Well, we have some of the best single target damage in the game, and now with Shadowflame Prism, we have excellent 5 target damage cleave. And combo that with our good uncapped AoE from Searing Nightmare, overall, we have a very consistent damage output, with good utility like Vampiric Embrace for Pride Healing and Mass Dispel for bursting or other magic debuffs. Now, is Shadowflame Prism the best legendary for Shadow Priests and Mythic Plus? Well, for the average player, I would say yes. This is because Shadowflame Prism has great single target priority damage with excellent 5 to 6 target cleave. Other legendaries like Eternal Call of the Void have good synergy with Searing Nightmare, but are RNG proc based and end up being less overall damage than Shadowflame Prism. Talbadar's has good single target damage, but has almost no value in cleave situations, and actually sims less on single target than Shadowflame Prism for nightfae Shadow Priest, or only slightly higher for other covenants. Twins is a good legendary for pushing high keys, but only if you have a good fire mage to give your PIOA to. Otherwise, Shadowflame Prism is going to be much more valuable in Mythic Plus for you. So for most keys, yes, Shadowflame Prism is going to be your best Mythic Plus legendary. Now, I talked about it not having very good synergy with Searing Nightmare. Well, that's true, but it still ends up being more overall damage. And for keys where you use Searing Nightmare, you're still going to use Searing Nightmare. Just end up weaving in your Searing Nightmares with your Mind Blast and Shadow Word Deaths. And I'm going to be covering this opener and rotation later on in the video using this legendary. So, what stat weight should we be aiming for in Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest? Well, in general, we want to aim for int over haste, over mastery, over or equal to crit, over verse. So why mastery over or equal to crit? In my opinion, mastery is better for keys than crit. This is because even though crit is more damage than mastery in pure high target mob count pools, mastery gains more value on priority damage and also lower target counts from 5 to 6 mobs or less. Crit is also less damage on sustained AoE, so mastery gains more value on hierarchy levels where packs live longer. Not to mention, for dungeons that have high mob counts where crit overtakes mastery, we can compensate for the lack of crit by taking talents like Ancient Madness and First Strike from the nightfae Korayn and Soulbind. We also make up for a lack of crit on gear by using crit trinkets such as Ruby and Hymnal. For enchants in Mythic Plus, the main weapon enchant you should use is Celestial Guidance, since it provides good damage for single target and AoE, whereas Sinful Revelation falls off in AoE damage value. For chest enchants, you can run either Eternal Insight or Eternal Stats, since both are about even. And for cloak enchants, you probably want to run the Avoidance Cloak enchant to help mitigate the damage from Pridefuls. Now we're going to look at talent setups for Mythic Plus. Here I'm going to cover some general talents that work in pretty much every dungeon. So for the first talent row, we're either going to pick between Death and Madness or Fortress of the Mind. Death and Madness is pretty much the go-to pick for Mythic Plus, especially when using Shadowflame Prism, due to the ability to reset Shadow Word Death and get more rifts during your Mindbender. Fortress of the Mind is a good choice for dungeons or groups that need more boss pride or priority damage on mobs in general, and Fortress of the Mind also requires less micromanagement than Death and Madness, with only a slight DPS decrease on overalls. Death and Madness, however, is also great for Spiteful and Explosive weeks, in which you can get plenty of free Shadow or Death resets and more Rift procs. On the next row, I primarily pick Body and Soul, which helps us to dodge mechanics using its speed boost, but you can also pick Sanlayan if you want to help with group pride healing or just healing in general. Most dungeons on this next talent row, we go with Searing Nightmare due to its high AoE potential. I'll cover what dungeons we choose Misery for in just a bit later in this video. And then for the 35 talent row, you can choose between either Psychic Horror or Last Word. This is depending on if you want an extra stun or if you think your group has a low number of melee kicks in which you can make up for that long kick cooldown. Mind Bomb is almost never used since it is only an in-cap and not a stun. With Shadowflame Prism and in AoE, Shadow Crash is pretty much always a good choice, and Mindbender is pretty much required when using Shadowflame Prism to proc as many rifts as possible. That way you have a lower cooldown on when you can actually use your legendary. But if you end up using a different legendary other than Shadowflame Prism, you can go Void Torrent for good priority damage and good overall damage. So in the last row, you can choose either Ancient Madness for high AoE dungeons or Hungering Void for dungeons with lower mob counts or harder bosses in which you want the sustained Void form or longer fights in general. So for a general soulbind that you can choose as nightfae to run with the setup I have listed on the screen right now is the Naya soulbind for its mastery bonus. Naya's mastery bonus is very strong in AoE and single target when paired with Void Form, and you can run double potency with Naya, in which you would run the Dissonant Echoes conduit and Haunting Apparitions conduit to get a good mix of cleave and priority damage. For finesse conduits, you can choose between any that you like to run. Clear Mind is good for bursting weeks in which you're casting Mass Dispel a lot and you need that reduced mana usage. And Mental Recovery is really good for having an AoE slow attached to your Psychic Scream to help your tanks kite. Power Onto Others is really only used if you're using the Twins legendary, and that's because it gives you a reduced cooldown on your PI when you give it to other players. Now, for this next talent and Soulbind setup I'm about to be showing you guys, it is using Ancient Madness and Korayn Soulbind with Rabid Shadows Conduit and First Strike allocated. So, this setup on my screen right now nets excellent high target AoE damage and makes up for the lack of crit on your gear. With that in mind, we only really want to run this setup in Halls of Atonement, the other side, Necrotic Wake, and Miss. This is due to the high target counts of these dungeons where crit gains a large amount of value. Rabid Shadows is also very strong as a conduit for our openers with this build since Shadowflame Prism will increase the duration of your Mindbender, and our crit with First Strike will absolutely slap mobs. So once again, you can choose between Death and Madness and Fortress of the Mind on this first row, but with this build specifically, Death and Madness is much better for these type of high target mob count keys. We're going to get a lot of mobs dying that you can execute with your Shadow or Death. Now I have Necrotic Wake and Miss as optional for using with this talent setup, and the reason for that is some key groups you might want more priority damage with the Naya Soulbind for Necrotic Wake, and Miss in general you can pretty much run any build in Miss and it'll work out fine. This build is good in Miss if your group is going to be pulling a lot of worms in the last half of Miss towards the final boss. So, for this next talent build we're going to be looking at, which uses Misery over Searing Nightmare, we really only want to run this setup in keys with low target mob count pools where we aren't really going to be using Searing Nightmare anyway. So the two dungeons I would use this setup is Theater of Pain and also Spires of Ascension, depending on how your group pulls Spires. You can still run Searing Nightmare in either of these keys if you prefer to, but it ends up being less beneficial for the group to do so. As for the 40 talent row, we're going to pick either between Auspicious Spirits or Shadow Crash. Auspicious Spirits, especially for higher keys in which the mobs are going to live longer and you're going to want that extra priority damage and insanity generation, as well as the damage from having more spirits go out. Whereas Shadow Crash is good for lower keys where you want the instant AoE damage and it's going to boost your overalls. With the Misery build, we're obviously going to choose Naya as a Soulbind for the Mastery and Double Potency conduits, which do much better on low target count pulls and smaller cleave. Now, here you can also run Fortress of the Mind again, and it actually gains probably a little bit more value than in the higher mob count pools where not really casting Mind Blast, whereas in these lower mob count pools, you're always casting Mind Blast. So it's a good choice, but once again, if you're running Shadowflame Prism, the Shadow or Death resets are very, very strong. So for this final talent build we're looking at currently, I am basically running the setup which I originally showed at the beginning of this talent section. So this setup with Searing Nightmare, Hungering Void, and Naya can be run in pretty much every dungeon and net similar overalls to the previous setups I just went over. That being said, the two dungeons I would primarily run this setup in is Sanguine Depths and Plaguefall. This is because Searing Nightmare is useful for a couple of large pools in both dungeons, but then the mastery from Naya and the duration of Void Form from Hungering Void gains value on the multiple smaller pools in between these large pools, and also gains value on the bosses in these dungeons, which are normally pretty hard. You can also run this optionally in Necrotic Wake and Miss, and net similar DPS overalls to the Korayn Ancient Madness build, with having more priority damage from the Naya Mastery and Hungering Void. So one last thing I want to cover is what's really the difference between Korayn and Naya, and which one is the best soulbind to choose? Well, there really isn't a best choice between these soulbinds. They both function in different ways for different situations. Naya is more priority damage and provides more mastery for dungeons with smaller mob counts, or more sustained damage for pools and higher keys where the mobs are going to live longer. Korayn provides more instant burst damage and crit for high mob pools where you want the big damage immediately. Stick to the dungeon recommendations I made in these talents, and you'll do pretty great with picking these soulbinds. Now I'm going to touch on our AoE opener and some rotational tips when it comes to Mythic Plus. So I'm going to start off by talking about the opener for up to 7 targets. And in this AoE opener for up to 7 targets, you're going to want to start off by casting Vampiric Touch on mobs as they're being grouped up. Usually you want to cast up to 3 to 4 Vampiric Touches on mobs depending on how fast the tank is grouping them up. And if it's 5 to 6 mobs in the pool, you can cast up to 5 to 6 Vampiric Touches if you're popping your PI early to help get these dots out. So immediately after the mobs are grouped up, it doesn't matter if you get the full 3 to 4 Vampiric Touches or not. As soon as they're grouped up, you're going to want to channel your Mind Seer, do one Searing Nightmare, then you're going to do an opener similar to your single target opener. So you're going to cast Fey Guardians after the one Searing Nightmare. You're going to cast your Mindbender, then you're going to PI and Trinket if you haven't PI'd already. Then Shadow Word Death, then cast Mind Blast, then you're going to Void Erupt, and then you're immediately going to go into Shadow Crash. Don't worry about Void Bolting. You can Void Bolt if you want, depending on how many Vampiric Touches you put out the mobs, and if you want to refresh those dots. Otherwise, you want to immediately Shadow Crash once you Void Erupt. That way, your Shadow Crash is getting the full benefit of, first of all, your mastery from Void Eruption, and second of all, the crit from your Trinket. Next, you're going to dump both your Mind Blast charges. Once again, don't worry about your Insanity bar. In fact, with this legendary, more than likely, you're going to be overcapping on Insanity. So get ready to expect that. You dump both your Mind Blasts. That way you're getting all your Rifts out very early, especially if you're running your first strike build with Ancient Madness. That way those Rifts are critting. And then you're going to start spamming Searing Nightmare. So after you dump your Mind Blast, you're going to hold your Mind Seer, spam 2 Searing Nightmares per Mind Seer, then recast Mind Seer, then spam 2 Searing Nightmares, then recast Mind Seer. In between those 2 Searing Nightmares, so after the first 2, your Mind Blast is probably going to be back off cooldown. You're going to Mind Blast on CD and Shadow Word Death on CD while your Mindbender is out. Once your Mindbender goes away, you're only going to be spamming Searing Nightmare. And this is for up to 7 targets. So, like I said, continue casting Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death on CD while spamming Searing Nightmare is basically your rotation after that original opener. And one thing you can do to help min-max your damage, if you need to move or cancel your target cast because of volcanic or quaking or some other mechanic, you can Void Bolt if you need to move. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother Void Bolting unless you're running Hungering Void, in which case you can Void Bolt basically on CD, but you want to prioritize getting your Mind Blast charges out and your Shadow or Death charges out while getting as many Searing Nightmares on the mobs as you can. The only reason you want to be Void Bolting at this target count is if the mobs are going to live for an extended period of time, so you want a longer Void form, or if the mob count isn't as high. So if it's 3 mobs, you're going to want to be Void Bolting still. 3 to 4 mobs, continue Void Bolting. Pretty much on CD. So what about for pools with over 7 targets? Well, in large pool counts, you basically want to start off by popping your Fey Guardians, then your Mindbender, and then I would PI and Trinket, and then Void Erupt. Don't bother dotting mobs with Vampiric Touch, especially if the mobs are going to die fast for mob counts over 7 targets. So, like I said, after you Void Erupt, you're going to want to Shadow Crash, once again, making sure you're getting that Mastery bonus and the Soul Letting Ruby crit, as well as if you're running Ancient Madness, you're getting that crit as well. And then you're just going to immediately start spamming Searing Nightmare. So, over 7 targets, it's not worth proccing your Shadowflame Prism Rift. The only time you want to proc your Rift from Shadowflame Prism is through Dark Thoughts Mind Blast casts, or Shadow or Death if you need to move, or Shadow or Death on mobs that are going to die if you're running Death and Madness, and you're going to get that Shadow or Death reset. Those are the only times you want to cast those. But other than that, you're pretty much only spamming Searing Nightmare. Don't worry about Void Bolting. Once again, it's not worth it, especially on 7+ targets. Now, why do I Mindbender there if we're not going to proc Rifts? Well, I like getting my Mindbender on CD since it's only a 1-minute CD, and you can have it up for the next pack after that pool if you Mindbender right away. One thing you can do though is you can save your Mindbender for towards the end of the pool when the mobs are starting to die. That way, the mob count is lower. So, like, if the mob count starts at like 10 mobs, towards the end of the pool, it might be like 5 mobs left that had higher health than the other mobs. And then your Mindbender is going to get the full value from its cleave. And you can also get Shadow or Death executes from the mobs that are dying earlier. So you can save your Mindbender for that. But if that's too much micromanagement for you, like I said, if you just Mindbender on CD, it's going to be up for the next pack. So you're not losing that much value by not proccing any rifts. You get that insanity generation and a little bit of damage from the Mindbender. So it's definitely worth. Now, for 7+ targets, only bother casting Vampiric Touch if there's a high health mob. And like when I say high health mob, I mean the mob is going to be alive after literally every other mob is dead. So why is that? Because you want to get the full duration of your Vampiric Touch on those mobs, and you're not really going to be casting Mind Blast to proc your apparitions anyway, so there's no reason to Vampiric Touch, especially if you're in Void form. You're getting the full mastery bonus from your Void form. And the only reason you'd Vampiric Touch a high health mob in general is because they're going to live after your Void form expires. So that's why. Next, I'm going to talk about some extra AoE rotation tips you would want to do. So the first tip I'm going to recommend is that you want to maintain your Vampiric Touch on mobs outside of Void form. This is for the Mastery bonus. So, as you know, Shadow Priest Mastery works when the more dots you have on the target, the more damage you're doing. Pretty simple. So having Vampiric Touch on mobs that are going to live for a long duration is worth it just for that extra damage. So if you're outside of Void form, I would only Vampiric Touch and maintain Vampiric Touch on up to 4 mobs. You can do maybe a little bit more if your PI is up and you can get those dots back out. Or if you're playing Misery, obviously, if you're playing Misery, you want to dot every mob and continue refreshing as much as you can. If the mobs are going to live for an extended period of time, then definitely refresh your Vampiric Touch. You keep that Mastery bonus so you can spam your Searing Nightmares. Now, some extra tips is when do you want to start Searing Nightmaring? Well, you're going to basically be pressing Devouring Plague on 2 mobs, and you would do 3 mob pools. You would still Devouring Plague on 3 mobs if you're in Void form. So Devouring Plague on 2 mobs if there's only 2 mobs in the pool. If you're in Void form, Devouring Plague on 3. For 3 mobs or more, outside of void form and in void form, if it's 4 mobs or higher, then you're going to want to just spam Searing Nightmare. Don't worry about Devouring Plaguing anymore, it's not worth it. Searing Nightmare on 3+ mobs. So, another tip, from 1 to 5 mobs, you're going to want to continue casting your Void Bolt and continue weaving in Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death on CD while Mindbender is active. If Mindbender's not active, don't worry about Mind Blasting, just spam Searing Nightmare, unless, of course, it's 1 to 3 mobs. Now, for 5 to 7 mob counts, you're going to want to continue to weave in Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death with Mindbender up in between Searing Nightmare spams, and you're only going to want to Void Bolt when you need to move. So from 5 to 7 mobs, you only Void Bolt when you need to move, or if you think the mob pack's going to live long enough where staying in Void form longer is going to benefit you. Now, for 7+ mobs, you no longer want to Void Bolt or cast Vampiric Touch, just spam Searing Nightmare. Just spam away. You can Vampiric Touch some mobs, but usually it's not worth it, especially if the mobs are going to die very fast. So that's a common theme. If the mobs are going to die quick, don't worry about Vampiric Touching. It is not worth it. So another thing to note on 7+ mobs, if your Mindbender is out, don't even worry about proccing Rifts, okay? You're getting more damage from just spamming Searing Nightmare, so there's no point in proccing your Rifts really, unless you have a Dark Thoughts cast, or if you're Shadow Word Deathing low health mobs, or Shadow Word Deathing when you need to move, stuff like that. So once again, these instant casts are really good for when you need to move and stop channeling, and you're going to gain a lot of damage from doing that as well. Okay, so here I have an example AoE opener on a mob pool with over 7 targets. So I start this pool off by getting my kick, and since I know the target is far away, I opt to Vampiric Touch him, since he's going to be late into the pack and he's going to live longer. I go straight into Fey Guardians, Mindbender, Shadow Word Death, PI Ruby, Void Erupt, Shadow Crash, and I start spamming Searing Nightmare. So that's a little quick, but the reason I opt to Shadow Word Death early is because we have Hero in this opener, so I know the cooldown is going to be back up pretty quick. And then I use it to move there, and I also cast my Dark Thoughts procs there while I'm moving. Get my second Shadow Crash, and here we're just AoEing with Searing Nightmare. More Searing Nightmare spam, and that's basically what the opener looks like. I know this example opener goes by pretty fast, but it's just a little taste of what an opener should look like, and hopefully that helped a little bit. So those are all my AoE openers and AoE rotation tips that I wanted to cover in this video. One last thing I wanted to talk about is if you should line up your Void form with Mindbender in Mythic Plus, especially as nightfae, and even any other covenant in general. Should you line up your Void form with your Mindbender in Mythic Plus? So, as a nightfae, using Fey Guardians, you're getting a minute and 10 Void form CD. So it's a lot easier to line up your Mindbender as a nightfae. But even with that in mind, I would still say that for most keys, it's not worth trying to line up your Mindbender with your Void form. And most of the time, I don't. This is because if you want to have the full duration of your Mindbender, sometimes you have to cast your Mindbender just on CD as soon as you get to the next pack. That way you're getting the full duration of your Mindbender without wasting any of the Mindbender duration as the pack's already dying. That being said, if the pack is going to live for the full duration of your Void form, paired with the full duration of your Mindbender, then it is worth saving your Mindbender for Void form. However, most packs and many keys, especially with the current group comps where you're running a mage who's combusting pretty much every pack, and boomkins who have Starfall and big burst damage cooldowns, the packs aren't going to live long enough for you to line up your Void form with your Mindbender. If you can line up your Void form with your Mindbender, then definitely do it. Obviously, you're going to get more damage from that because of the mastery bonus and the extra Mind Blast. But in general, if you think the pack's going to die before your Void form comes up, just Mindbender it. You're going to gain more damage on overall for doing that, and it's going to help benefit your group more. So, TLDR for that part, don't worry about trying to line up your Void form with Mindbender. It's just not worth it most of the time. Anyway, with all that being said, that's the end of the video. Hopefully this M Plus guide was helpful to you, and if you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe for more Shadow Priest content. I know it took me a while to make this video, but I had a lot of school stuff going on, and I'll try to make more videos in the future to help people out. But if you have any further questions about this video or anything Mythic Plus or Shadowflame Prism, please let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. And thanks for watching.